at some point you have to confront in yourself the tendency to view yourself as the main character of your own story, right? And if you view yourself as the main character of your own story, that has implications, and it has real life, these ideas have price tags, has real life cost to the way that you're going to see the world around you, the way you're going to see yourself, the way you're going to allow yourself to respond to opportunity, the way you even spot out opportunity if it's obvious to you or invisible to you, is going to be kind of reliant upon how closed off you are from what's actually there. Because if you think that you're the main character of your own story, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on, right? And you're going to miss a lot of why it's going on.
Yeah.
And ultimately what happens when somebody is in a mode like that, it can lead to multiple different ends. It's not like that's a uniform experience for people, but one of the ends that it can lead to, that Jalen just alluded to, is that eventually you get to a point where you think there isn't a better story and I despise this one. That's where suicide lives, right?
Sure.
And so there isn't a better story. I'm convinced there simply isn't one, right? Take your practical, reasonable desires and goals and things that you have nested in here that should be ranked according to whatever is the most important thing, right? Whatever's at the top of everything is going to guide all of those goals along the way. And if you can take that practical, goal-oriented thought process and nest it into an ongoing narrative that doesn't end at you, but you are sharing a narrative space with everyone else around you, right? And so that means that your goals and your orientation towards your goals have to be shifted, which is why I think we often get we get angry at the inconvenience of the world being just as real as we are, and it feels like it's an interruption, like the doting mother and the frustrated father, because the mother is at home with the children and they're lovely, and the father, let's say, smashed his finger at work that day, had to work 4 hours overtime, and is coming home with a sore back. And as soon as he walks in the door, the kids are like, "Dad, let's play jungle gym on his body." And the dad's like, "No," it's like everything that's happening in that situation, the kids don't know that they're not the main character. The wife has forgotten that the husband is a very key character, because she'll be frustrated with his reaction, and he's forgotten that he's not the main character, right? And so the first and the most immediate things that happen out of that is everyone has these disjointed reactions that are not copacetic with one another. They're not coherent, right? Because they're not all existing in the same narrative space anymore.
Even in that disjointedness, everybody's own perspective is through the lens of them being the main character of the story. Everybody's looking at it from their perspective, their way of thinking, their way of seeing the situation as the single source way of seeing the situation. And it all starts and ends with me.
Exactly. And that closed, self-oriented way of viewing things,
yes,
that informs the way that we experience and the way that we attend, in a genuinely exacted literal sense.
Yeah.
That changes the way you attend. It changes the way you experience. It changes your very perceptions to think this way. And so if you have the wherewithal to have a purposeful shift of perspective, you can start to orient yourself towards something that is others oriented as much as it is self-oriented. And then eventually, in maturity, some people are capable of being others oriented more than self-oriented. And those are particularly people that we see as saintly in a genuine sense, because what they're doing is something that is genuinely beyond us. And that when you see somebody that's genuinely beyond you, you look up to them.
To see a person, a human being, deliberately put the needs and well-being of others above their own, like you said, is something to look up to. And like you said, we call them saints, or we call them angelic. All of these terms that transcend the human experience.
So it just makes me wonder, okay, so we look up to people who are able to put others' needs above themselves. Some people are able to naturally do that just according to disposition, probably openness and agreeableness and different things like that. Sure. But let's just say, okay, I'm somebody, like, I even realize this sometimes in my own self, that I obviously have the tendency to view my own story through my own first person lens. I get caught up in being cast out to sea by these unintended stories that I don't intend to get caught up in. So we all kind of get sucked into these worlds that we've now crafted for ourselves. We don't have a way of getting out unless we're consciously getting out of them. What is the way that y'all break out of those cycles? Or what are the ways that you would suggest people break out of those cycles? That if we're not going to hyper focus on all the details and we're going to look out and zoom out on this lens, what is a way to do that, not only as an individual, but as a society, if we're recognizing this is a societal based problem?
In a very abstract sense, there are two things that you can do about it before you do anything. Usually they're to do with slowing down and attending. Those are two things that I would say are crucial for being able to overcome that feeling of being overwhelmed by too much too quickly. I've come to recognize that there are finite stories and there are infinite stories. And the finite stories in my life can be things like I'm having a fun day with my kids at the beach, or it could be I've had 3 fights with my wife today. And that finite story is going to have merit and weight to carry over for some length of time. It's an indeterminate length of time. Many things can happen in a finite story that make it long and impactful, right? But in those tiny little increments of my experiences, I have the ability, or I have the jurisdiction over my own experiences to tell myself how ordinate my reaction to these things are. So it's taking time to slow down and realize that this is a very small story. And this one, it has an expiration date.
Sure.
And therefore, I need to ask myself what length of time I should afford myself to be bothered by it, right? This is something that I use for people who are in the program where I work at the mission, who are having, let's say, a bad week and are thinking about leaving the program and inevitably going to relapse. And I'll remind them, you are here for a year, my friend. You are having a bad week. If you had $4 million in the bank right now and somebody wasted $100, would you throw away $4 million? And they'd say, no, that's stupid. And I'd say, that's exactly right. So this $10 that you're upset about right now, compared to the wealth that you're going to have with the full investment, don't waste your time and attention. And that centers them back into seeing things from a right perspective. What unfortunately that relies on is community, because you need somebody with an outside perspective to draw you back. That's something that you need that otherness for. And so it's really an interreliance from one person to another to be willing to make those investments. But it also takes the person who's feeling the overwhelm, the waves, the tsunami of life is happening right now. I need to be able to say that that's what's happening.
What am I supposed to be experiencing within this larger experience, right? Is the way that I am experiencing life in and of itself, does it jive with the larger story and the way that that's structured and the way that that's put together? And because then if I'm looking at it that way, all of a sudden I become smaller, right? And now I'm no longer the center either. I'm actually trying to find my place within the larger story, within the larger narrative. And that in doing so, that takes the focus off of just everything being about me, and what I want to hear, what I want to feel, so on and so forth. And it puts it on other people, because then you start looking at other people and saying, okay, well, wait a second. Well, I know I'm not the center of the story. Well, if I'm not, chances are you probably aren't either. Right. And so then it becomes, okay, well, what role do we play in the larger story, even together in our relationship? Right. This relationship could even be reflective of a bigger relationship. How does that flow? What is all of this pointing towards?
And then the other half of that also, because it sounded like your question, if I'm not wrong, is sometimes I get lost in so many other people's narrative that I don't have this HQ, seemingly. I don't have
something
this
grounding
center of the world to come back to, right?
Sure.
For that, I would say almost the opposite. It's time to localize your attention. For those situations, it's kind of like the opposite. Like the person who's an introvert is too inside. They need to push their attention outward, and it helps them to be less awkward. The person who's extroverted needs to become more self-aware because they take up a lot of space in the room. right?
Mhm.
And so oftentimes the way to fix a problem is by looking at the way that you could almost like play the tape in reverse, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right. Where if you're getting too lost up in other people's experiences, if you get too lost in other people's values, other people's opinions, and other people's needs, and all these other things, you can genuinely become like entirely overwhelmed and ordinately overwhelmed, because why in the hell would we think that we have enough resource to deal with the world?
Mhm.
That's it. That's some, in some sense, it's a God complex, the main character, but in a very different way, because
Right.
we're allowing ourselves to take wave upon wave that wasn't even aimed at us.
Mhm.
We're just getting in the
Yep.
way, and so sometimes we're trying to fill a gap that isn't ours to fill. See, if I get overwhelmed with ministry, it's because I haven't been ministering to my family properly every time. My family is my first mission field, and so if I localize my attention, every other ministry begins to flourish because things are in their proper place. But it's like if I push my attention outward too far and I take up too much space, the things that are closest to the center, I'm not there. All my attention is pushed elsewhere. And so it's like I have to be able to jump back and forth between those two things, because these things happen, like Jalen just pointed out, at several levels of resolution all at
Mhm.
once. And if
Mhm.
you have too much coming in, so it's like a camera lens. You let too much light in, you get overexposure. And then it's just this blanket thing. There's
Yeah.
nothing to demarcate. Everything's just plain the same, And if there's too little light, then you can't see anything and you don't know what's going on. There's very little detail happening. The excess of detail or the absence of detail. And the
Mhm.
problems are kind of mirroring each other, but they're two different ways that I would go about trying to deal with them.
It just reminds me of something related to like how we understand the Christian story or the story of the Bible, right? Because usually the way that we tell the Christian story is something like creation, fall, some kind of story of redemption, and then new creation. And so what we do is we look backwards to Adam and Eve and we say there was something good then, and now we're in the not yet, like we're in the bad, and there will be something good in the future, but like this is the only way to read the story. Whereas when you look through the Hebrew Bible, what they see is like there was something good back then.
Sure.
And we kind of read the Christian story as like as if the Garden of Eden is no longer available to us until sometime way out in the future. But the way that the Hebrew Bible kind of reads that is that the Garden of Eden is available to you now as you journey towards God. And then as you move away from God, then you are leading yourself towards death into the land of wasting and dying. And so the story that we could get caught up in, and the story that you see them repeating and reenacting over and over and over again throughout the story of Israel, if they're doing it right, the liturgical calendar rightly, their ritual calendar rightly, is that they have pilgrimage festivals where they're moving into eternal life at Zion, which represents I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That represents Eden now. And then they have Yom Kippur, which is a fasting festival where you do not go to Zion. There is a priest and one other man who are there dealing with those goats. And then you are away. So you are in the land of wasting and dying, experiencing your own death. So you have these festivals where you experience life and then you experience death. You're in between feasting and fasting. Man, I feel like this is our culture. Without conscious rituals of loss and renewal, individuals and societies lose the capacity to experience the sorrows and joy that are essential for feeling fully human. Without them, life flattens out and meaning drains from both living and dying. Soon there is a death of meaning and an increase in meaningless deaths. There's a death of meaning and an increase in meaningless deaths. Like that's what we're talking about. Like with the ending of one's own life is the ending of your own story, because there is no meaning for you to continue to participate.
It just speaks to the degradation of the value of life, right? And just the meaningless of it all. Like just in our society as a whole, life no longer means much, right? And so if somebody who I dislike passes away, I view it as something to celebrate, as opposed to something to be sorrowful over. Kind of just that despondence, that disassociation from the sacredness of life.
I like the bit about the ritualized experience of like death, and renewal. In our modern sense, what that would be is a coming of age story. A coming of age story is something where you fall into a problem, then you overcome a problem, and then you enter into a new phase, right? A tragedy is when you fall into a problem, you don't overcome a problem, and no new phase is entered. And so a boy in a tribal society would have been sent out into the forest for 3 days to survive and come back as a man, or they didn't come back.
Or you have Peter Pan syndrome now. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And the absence of that is the Peter Pan problem. Is
Right.
I want to stay potential. I don't want to become anything individuated. I just like to be able. I don't want to do. I just like to be able. Right. And so it's like the ultimate problem of freedom is that infinite potential can never spew itself forth into something that becomes finally the one single thing that it becomes. Right. Like when you're a kid, you could be anything, but then you grow up and you become something. Right. And if you don't grow up, you don't become anything. Right. It's like that's yes, I'm a real boy. Yes, very good. You stay a wooden-headed puppet, and then somebody else will end up using you and pulling your string. Those are the two main arcs that story usually takes. And if you take them in like a biblical sense, the two main arcs of tragedy and redemption are made explicit in our understanding of angels and fallen angels. Fallen angels are a tragedy, and fallen human is a story of possible redemption. And so the redeemed man is the right story. The unredeemed man is the ultimate tragedy. That in the biblical sense, that's the framework for that infinite story that I was talking about before, is you have something that can be so big that it has room to contain everything else inside it. You need a story that's big enough to fit everything that matters, and not just what matters to you, but what matters, period. Everybody else is going to be involved in that story one way or the other, you know? And if that's true, this is one of the again, ideas have price tags. If that's true, then my sin matters because it does something to everything. If we take this problem seriously, it's not just the evils that happen in the world, because evil's out there somewhere in the ether. The problem is that evil happens in here.
Yep.
That's really the biggest problem of evil, is that evil happens in here.
And I appreciate you saying that, Josh, because oftentimes when you talk about the problem of evil, right, you know, there are a few things that come to mind when you hear it, right? You think Holocaust, right? You think transatlantic slave trade. You think Rwandan genocide. You think North Korea, China, right? You think about those type of evils and those type of kind of the abhorrent evils, right?
Or you even think of like the natural evils, like the tsunami, hurricane, something like that, that just leads to senseless death.
And all of those are those they make sense. They are terrible things that happen, but oftentimes what we don't focus on, right, is the evil at my doorstep, the doorstep of my heart. We don't spend a whole lot of time talking about that evil, right? We kind of focus, even in our perspective on the problem of evil. You know, I'm looking out at everyone else as the center of my own, as the main character of my own story, looking at everyone else, you know, looking at the evils that they commit, not necessarily looking at the evil that, like I said, that's right here at the doorstep of my heart and the things that I got going on, that I may write off as, you know, not that big a deal, or I can explain away, right? Because nobody can justify my evil the way that I can.
And so then that leaves us in a position of sharing the gospel in such a way to someone who their biggest problem with God might be that a great evil was committed against them.
Sure.
And they need to process that. But instead we're kind of almost re-traumatizing them just to give them the good news, right? And so, but if we could consider that heinous evil that's committed against us, I mean, it's been committed against like me and my own family's history and things like that, some of that senseless Holocaust type evil, right? And it's like, who would I be if I let that evil consume me, right? It would end my own story, and it would prevent me from living into a life of meaning and beauty, right? If I let that evil consume me. But I have to now find a story in which that evil now can be consumed, so that then I move into the meaning and beauty, right? Because we have one of two options. We can either live with that kind of resentment building inside of us, or we can find a way to process it and move on.